I didn't mind being alone at home for a few days. My parents traveled a lot for work, and it wasn't the first time they left me in charge of the house. But this time felt different. Our home is about 30 minutes from town, surrounded by woods that stretch for miles. It's quiet out here, usually too quiet. The first night was uneventful. I stayed up late binge-watching a series, enjoying the freedom of having the house to myself. But as I was heading to bed around midnight, I noticed something odd. The kitchen door, which I distinctly remember locking, was slightly ajar. I locked it again, chalking it up to me being distracted earlier. The second night is when things started getting strange. I was in the living room scrolling through my phone when I heard a soft noise upstairs. It wasn't loud, more like a shuffle or something being dragged across the floor. I froze, staring at the ceiling. Our house is old, and it creaks, but this didn't sound like the usual settling noises. After a few minutes of silence, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe a squirrel on the roof, or some random house noise. I turned back to my phone. That's when I heard it again, louder this time, a distinct thump coming from my parents' bedroom. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously climbed the stairs. Each step seemed to echo in the silence. When I reached their room, the door was slightly open. I nudged it with the flashlight, illuminating the empty space. Nothing seemed out of place. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there. The third night, I decided to sleep with my bedroom door locked. It was around 2 a.m. when I woke up to a faint sound, whispering. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but the sound grew louder. It was coming from downstairs. I tried to listen closely, but the whispers were muffled, like multiple voices speaking at once, overlapping. My throat tightened as I sat up in bed, straining to catch words or phrases, but I couldn't make sense of them. Gripping my phone, I crept to the door and unlocked it, stepping into the dark hallway. The whispers stopped. I stood there, heart hammering, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Then I noticed it, the faint glow of the kitchen light spilling into the hallway. I was sure I had turned it off before bed. Summoning whatever courage I had left, I walked downstairs. The kitchen light was on, and the fridge door was open. Nothing was missing, but the eerie stillness made my skin crawl. I turned off the light and headed back to my room, locking the door behind me. By the fourth day, I was exhausted. Whatever was happening, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the house's electrical system was acting up. Maybe I was imagining the whispers. But that evening, as I was cleaning the living room, I knocked over a small framed photo of my family. When I picked it up, I saw a word scratched faintly into the back of the frame. Help. I dropped the frame. This wasn't normal. This wasn't the house settling. I called my parents, but they were on a long flight and didn't answer. Desperate, I decided to dig into the history of the property. I started searching online, piecing together what little information I could find. It turns out, our house wasn't the first one built here. Decades ago, there was a smaller home on this land. A family of 5 lived here until a fire broke out, killing all but one, a young boy who was never found. That night, the whispers returned, louder and more frantic, circling the house like a storm. Objects began to shift on their own, chairs scraping across the floor, doors creaking open and shut. At one point, I swear I saw a shadow dart across the hallway. I tried to convince myself it was just the dim lighting, but deep down I knew better. The final straw came just before dawn. I heard footsteps outside my bedroom door. They stopped just outside. Then came a knock, soft but insistent. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. After what felt like an eternity, I whispered, "Who's there?" A child's voice, faint and distorted, answered,
"Help me."
I didn't open the door. Instead, I waited, clutching my phone, until the sun finally rose and the house went quiet. When my parents came home the next day, I told them everything. They seemed skeptical but promised to look into the history of the house. I stayed with a friend for a week, unable to set foot back inside. I don't know what's in that house or what it wants. But every now and then, when I pass by, I feel its eyes watching me from the windows. I spent the weekend at my grandmother's house, a place I'd never liked staying, even as a child. It was one of those massive, creaky Victorian houses filled with dark wood, strange smells, and shadows that seemed to cling to the corners. My grandmother, Eleanor, was a peculiar woman. Her life revolved around her antiques, especially her handmade dolls. Dozens of them lined the shelves in her sitting room, each one with its own small, hand-painted face. She called them her treasures, but to me, they were just unsettling. Their eyes, though painted, seemed to follow you, and their stiff little arms always seemed frozen mid-reach. I was staying there because she'd asked for help while she was recovering from a fall. But by the time I arrived, she was in the hospital after another episode. The house was empty. I spent the first day wandering the maze of rooms, avoiding the sitting room entirely. The house felt colder than I remembered, and each floorboard groaned as if protesting my presence. Late in the afternoon, while searching for an extra blanket, I stumbled across a locked door in the upstairs hallway. I didn't recall it from my childhood visits, but it must have been locked back then too. The key was easy to find, hanging on a hook nearby, almost as if someone had wanted me to open it. Inside was a room unlike the rest of the house, no dusty furniture or faded wallpaper. Instead, the walls were lined with shelves filled with dolls. Hundreds of them, each more detailed than the last. Their faces were unnervingly expressive, some with wide grins, others with teary eyes or furrowed brows. In the center of the room stood a large, antique workbench. Tools and scraps of fabric lay scattered across it. A journal rested open, its pages covered in my grandmother's familiar spidery handwriting. Curiosity got the better of me, and I began to read. At first, it seemed like a craftsman's notes, sketches of doll designs, lists of materials, and descriptions of techniques. But as I flipped through, the entries became darker. She wrote about binding and preservation. She mentioned names, people she had preserved in her dolls. One name stood out to me, my Uncle Richard. He had disappeared years ago, and no one in the family ever spoke of him. I slammed the journal shut, suddenly aware of how still the house had become. Even the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway seemed muffled. As I left the room, I felt like I was being watched. I told myself it was just the dolls, their unblinking eyes playing tricks on me. That night, the silence was oppressive. Every creak, every whisper of wind against the window felt amplified. Around midnight, I heard it, a soft shuffling sound, like something small dragging across the floor. I froze, straining to hear where it was coming from. It wasn't outside. It was in the house. The shuffling grew louder, then stopped right outside my bedroom door. Is someone there? I called. Silence. Gathering every ounce of courage, I opened the door. The hallway was empty, but one of the dolls from the sitting room sat in the middle of the floor. I recognized it immediately. It had always been my least favorite, with its hollowed-out smile and cracked porcelain face. I picked it up, intending to put it back downstairs, but its head tilted on its own. I dropped it. Backing away, I bumped into something solid. Turning, I came face to face with another doll, a taller one that hadn't been there before. Its painted eyes stared up at me unblinking. I ran. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, the sitting room door creaked open. Inside, every doll had been moved. They weren't on the shelves anymore. They were standing, sitting, leaning against furniture, all facing the doorway. Then one of them spoke. It wasn't a voice like you'd hear in a movie. It was faint, scratchy, like a distant echo of someone screaming.
Help us.
I staggered back. The journal, her notes about preservation, suddenly made horrific sense. She wasn't making dolls. She was trapping people in them. The floorboards creaked behind me. Turning, I saw a figure emerging from the shadows, a tall, thin doll, but its face wasn't painted. It was Richard's face. I don't remember how I got out of the house. All I know is that I ran until I couldn't breathe, and I didn't stop until I reached my car. The house has been locked up ever since. I've tried to tell my family, but no one believes me. My grandmother passed away 2 weeks ago, and I refused to go back for the funeral. But sometimes late at night, I hear faint shuffling outside my apartment door. It started as a normal work-from-home day. My company had transitioned to fully remote during the pandemic, and I'd grown used to the monotony of Zoom calls, endless emails, and the quiet hum of my apartment. It was comforting in a way, having the world filtered through a screen, safely disconnected. But then something changed. The first time I noticed, it was during our Monday morning team meeting. Everyone's cameras were on, as usual, and we were doing the awkward small talk before diving into our tasks. My coworker Jamie was mid-sentence when their screen froze. Not unusual, bad connections happen. But as Jamie's video glitched, I noticed something off. For just a split second, their face didn't look like their face. It was twisted, distorted, almost as if someone else's features were layered over theirs. Sunken eyes, a crooked jaw, and a mouth stretched far too wide. I blinked, convinced it was a trick of the screen. Jamie's video unfroze, and they continued talking like nothing happened. I didn't say anything. Who would believe me? The next incident happened 2 days later, during a one-on-one with my manager, Lisa. We were discussing quarterly goals when her voice cracked. At first, I thought it was just static interference, but then it changed entirely. It wasn't her voice anymore. The sound was guttural, low, like a growl trying to form words. It sent shivers up my spine. Then just as suddenly, her normal voice came back. She didn't seem to notice. "Are you okay?" I asked, hesitant. Lisa frowned, tilting her head. "Yeah, why?" I dropped it. But by the end of the week, it was undeniable. Every meeting, every call, something was wrong. Faces flickered in and out of monstrous shapes, voices warped into inhuman tones, and even the backgrounds in people's videos seemed to shift unnaturally. Once, I swear I saw movement behind Lisa, something crawling on her ceiling. When I brought it up, she turned her camera off without explanation. The worst part was that no one else seemed to notice. I started recording the meetings to prove to myself I wasn't imagining things. But every time I played them back, the glitches weren't there. The videos were perfectly normal, like I'd dreamed the whole thing. Then people began to change. Jamie, who used to laugh and joke during our calls, became unnervingly quiet. Lisa started missing meetings entirely, only responding to emails with curt, emotionless replies. More and more of my coworkers turned off their cameras, and when they did show up, their behavior was off. They'd stare too long at the screen, barely blink, and their smiles never reached their eyes. One night, I stayed up combing through old emails and meeting notes, looking for a pattern. Anything to explain what was happening. Around 2 a.m., I heard a faint clicking sound coming from my laptop. I hadn't touched it in hours. The screen lit up on its own, the webcam activating without warning. I froze, staring as the screen flickered. At first, it was my reflection, wide-eyed and pale in the dim light. Then, something else appeared. Behind me, it wasn't human. A long, gaunt figure with empty sockets for eyes and a mouth hanging open in a silent scream. It stood just behind my chair, close enough to touch me. I whipped around, heart in my throat, but the room was empty. When I turned back to the screen, the figure was gone. I slammed the laptop shut and didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I tried to call Jamie. No answer. Lisa's number went straight to voicemail. The company website listed several of my co-workers as no longer with the organization, but there were no announcements, no explanations. By Friday, I was the only one on the team who hadn't vanished. That evening, my laptop powered on by itself again. This time, it opened directly to a Zoom call. My camera was on. So were the cameras of all my missing co-workers. Their faces filled the screen, but they weren't them. Each one looked stretched and wrong, their features grotesque and frozen in unnatural expressions. They stared directly into their cameras, unmoving, and then they spoke. Not individually, but all at once. Their voices layered over each other, a chaotic symphony of distorted, inhuman tones. "Join us." I slammed the laptop shut and ran. I didn't stop until I was at a friend's house, shaking and out of breath. I haven't gone back to my apartment since. My laptop is still there, open and waiting. Sometimes late at night, I think I hear that faint clicking sound in the walls, like something trying to connect. I haven't logged into another video call. I can't. But deep down, I know it's not over. Because every time I pass a reflective surface, I swear I see someone standing behind me. When my family moved into that house, it seemed like the perfect place to start fresh. It was a century-old Victorian tucked away in a quiet neighborhood, surrounded by tall oak trees. The realtor warned us it needed work, but we saw it as a project, something to make our own. Looking back, I wonder if she knew what was buried there. It started small. Tools left in one place would appear somewhere else. A hammer we'd set down in the living room would show up in the kitchen. We joked about it at first, blaming house gremlins or just our own forgetfulness. But then the accidents began. My dad was sanding a section of the staircase when the sander suddenly powered off. He cursed, figuring it was a faulty outlet, but when he checked, the cord was shredded, like something had chewed through it. Later that same day, I found my paintbrush standing upright in a can of paint, bristles pointed toward the ceiling. No one admitted to putting it there. Things escalated when we started on the basement. The basement was the worst part of the house, cold, damp, and always smelling faintly of iron. The walls were covered in this weird, uneven plaster, and the previous owners had left behind a massive steel table in the corner. It was scarred and stained, the kind of thing you'd see in an old operating room. My mom wanted it gone immediately, but it was too heavy to move, so we worked around it. While stripping the plaster from the walls, my dad uncovered a recessed door. It was small, just big enough for someone to crawl through. It wasn't on the floor plan. We pried it open to find a narrow passage leading into what looked like a second, hidden basement. The air inside was suffocating. The space was filled with surgical lights, trays of rusted tools, and jars. I still have nightmares about those jars. Some held shriveled, unrecognizable things suspended in murky liquid. Others were empty but lined with deep scratches, like something had tried to claw its way out. Dad wanted to seal the room off immediately. We started sorting through the mess, looking for clues about the people who had lived here. That's when we found the photographs. They were black and white, curled at the edges, and showed people lying on tables, hooked up to machines that looked straight out of a mad scientist's lab. Their faces were blurred, either by motion or intentional smudging, but their hands were twisted, clawed. One photo showed a man with wires running from his fingertips to his skull. Another featured a child, no older than 10, with surgical markings all over their torso. That night, none of us slept. The next morning, the house felt different. The air seemed thicker, harder to breathe. Mom tried to cook breakfast, but every egg she cracked was black inside. The fridge started humming loudly, like a far-off scream. In the basement, we found stains spreading from the walls, dark red and slick. Dad swore it was just old pipes leaking rust, but it smelled like blood. Worse, the steel table wasn't where we'd left it. It had moved 3 feet closer to the staircase, scraping deep gouges into the concrete floor. Dad tried to laugh it off, saying the floor must not be level, but his hands were shaking. That evening, we decided to stop renovations altogether. Whatever was in this house didn't want us here. While packing up tools in the basement, I noticed something new. The steel table was covered in scratches, as if someone, or something, had been dragged across it. The tools we'd left out were arranged in a perfect line, each blade gleaming as if freshly sharpened. Then the lights went out. In the pitch black, we heard it, metal dragging against concrete. Mom screamed, and I fumbled for my phone to use as a flashlight. When the beam finally cut through the darkness, I saw the table had moved again. This time, it was directly beneath the surgical lights. And then the walls. They started to move. It was subtle at first, like the house was breathing, the plaster expanding and contracting. But soon, the surface cracked, oozing that same dark red substance. We ran. The next day, we called a demolition crew. We couldn't sell the place, not after what we'd found. But when the crew arrived, they refused to work. The lead contractor took one look at the basement and said, "This isn't a house. It's a trap." We left everything behind, furniture, clothes, even family heirlooms. To this day, I don't know what the house wanted or why it let us leave. Sometimes, I wonder if it's still there, waiting for its next family, hungry to finish what was started in that hidden room.
Please subscribe for more stories.